Welcome to Knights of Columbus Presents. My name is Paul Morano. Glad you could join us today. Have a very special guest, Sue Ellen Browder, who is the author of Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movements. Sue Ellen, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. Lots of things to discuss in this hour. Why don't we begin with one of the foundational points in your book?
Okay.
And that is, at the beginning of this entire movement thing, the women's movements and the sexual revolution were two different things going in parallel but different directions.
Two radically different movements, actually.
Two radically different movements.
Yeah.
And eventually, in the 1960s, they conflated and became the same. Why don't you give a little background on that?
That's right. That's the reason why I began to write this book. When I was at Cosmopolitan, I wrote for Cosmopolitan magazine. I was a journalist. I'd gone to journalism school, and I went to the Cosmopolitan. And the thing that I noticed there, sitting at my little blue desk at Cosmo in 1971, was that the women's movement and the sexual revolution were two radically different movements. Helen Gurley Brown, who was the editor of Cosmo, would have loved for her Sex Revolution magazine to be part of the women's movement. But Betty Friedan, who had launched the women's movement in 1963 with her book, The Feminine Mystique, called Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible. So how did we get to the point where so many young women today think to be free is to go to college, get a great degree, have a fantastic job, and be as sexually free as possible? How did those two get joined together?
Great question.
Well,
that's my next question.
That was the nugget. That was the little seed that started me doing some research that actually took me 5 years to find the answer. So we're going to talk about a lot of that today.
All right. Good. Yeah, that's so important to figure that out.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about you.
Okay.
You grew up in Iowa.
Yes.
You have a wealth of experience that you're going to share with us today. You started off as a kind of a farm girl, country girl in Iowa?
Small town.
Small town girl,
yeah.
okay.
Small town.
Get that.
There was a small town in Iowa. I was desperate to get out of it. I thought small town meant small mind. I've changed my mind about that, by the way. But you know, I was 18, right? You want to get out of town and make a big splash in the world.
Okay.
I went to the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And it's one of the best journalism schools in the country. Okay. And when I got out, I went to, first I went to a newspaper and worked for a while. And then I was married at that time. I got married in college.
Before we get to your marriage, were you brought up in any certain religion?
Yes, I was a Congregationalist.
Okay.
Okay. My dad had been a Methodist Sunday school teacher. And in this little small town, we went to church every Sunday. And my dad I had a wonderful dad, just a wonderful dad, very empowering. I was the first child, and I was his only child until I was 9. I was the girl. Okay. And so he poured all his love into me. I was the boy, I was the girl, I was everything. But anyway, he would drive slower on Sunday to church because this was a holy day. And as a child, it drove me crazy. I'm like, why are we driving so slow? You know, but he drove slower to church. He was very, very devout, beautiful man. And so I did grow up in the church, and I actually taught Sunday school in high school.
Then what attracted you to Cosmopolitan magazine?
I was at the University of Missouri. We had a class on magazine markets, how to sell an article to different magazines, because I majored in magazine writing. That's what I majored in. And there was this class called Magazine Markets. And you could choose a magazine, and then you had to analyze it and see what you thought would help somebody sell an article to that magazine. And I chose Cosmo because I was very glamour struck. I was a small town girl. I loved the idea of glamour, you know. So I chose Cosmo. And the first thing I noticed as I was going through that magazine, I told my journalists in training, the other colleagues there at the university, that I thought all of these stories in that magazine were made up. I said, I didn't think they were real.
You thought that, and so you had some
I thought
insight.
that even before I got to Cosmo and found out they were made up.
Yeah.
So I told them I think they're made up. They were too pat. Anytime you have a story that's just so pat, it just didn't seem. And also, I'm from the Midwest, and women weren't living like that out there.
Right. Now, what year was this when you were in college, approximately?
That was '68. I graduated in '68. So that was
so that was the year that things really started to get going in terms of the sexual revolution, which obviously evolved into our culture of death today.
That's right.
Wow. So you said that you were, did you meet your future husband there at that college?
In college, yeah.
Okay, University of Missouri.
Yeah.
So he was going there at the time?
He was going there. Actually, I met him in a shoe store. We were both working in a shoe store. My dad owned a shoe store.
Right, in Iowa, yeah.
Yes. So I got a job, part-time job in a shoe store, and Walter was there.
First boyfriend?
First,
real
no,
one?
not the first. Well, the first real one.
Okay, first real one.
He was. Let's put it this way. I had dated a lot of boys that were on a scale of 1 to 10 that were 4s, and Walter was an 11.
There you go.
He was a romantic. Yeah. He wanted to be a writer. Like I did. He wanted to go to New York City the way I did. We had so much in common. We became writers. We lived together 24/7. We wrote together.
Right.
We worked together. We loved together. We had children together. It was a beautiful marriage.
So you got married in college?
Got married in college.
Okay, and then you completed college and you're looking for work?
Yes. Okay. Well, what happened is we completed college and we went to Los Angeles for a year because we wanted to play for a year after we were in college. And so we did. We went and played. And actually, I got pregnant at that point. Okay. And I got fired from I worked on a newspaper and I got fired for being pregnant.
So you went into your boss and said, hey, I've got some good news. I'm with child, thinking that he's going to say, hey, this is awesome. But he just immediately fired you?
Well, yeah, there was a policy in those days, and people forget this. Women were being fired for being pregnant. There was a policy there, and in most, many corporations, that you couldn't, once you got into your 5th month, you had to quit. And with no promise of being hired once the baby was born.
So this 5th month policy was one of theirs, or was it sort of a universal kind of policy?
It was the newspaper's policy there. Okay. And he told me, so he frowned at me and said, well, you can only work till your 5th month. Well, so I lied, because we were getting ready to go back to New York City anyway in a year, or in that time about 6 months. So I told him I was 5 months pregnant when I was actually 8 months pregnant. And I'm very short. So yes. I was like very big, and everybody on staff knew. The guys were saying, oh, 5 months, huh? 5 months. And so I worked till I was 8 months, and then when we drove across country in our Volkswagen Bug and landed in New York City.
So where did you beginning to work at Cosmopolitan, when did that occur? Right around this time?
No, when we got to New York, I got a number of temporary jobs, and I got a job in a newspaper for a while at the Riverdale Press. And then there was a job, a magazine job, advertised, it didn't say where it was, in the New York Times. And I thought, oh, I'm a magazine writer, I need a magazine job. So I applied, and it was Cosmopolitan. The same magazine that I had analyzed at the University of Missouri.
Was Helen Gurley Brown involved yet?
Yes, she was there. Yes, she was there.
So she was transformed. The magazine had already been transformed by the time you got there?
Yes, it had.
Now, let me ask you something. Working for that magazine, didn't your past, being brought up as a Christian with the memories of your father and driving to church every Sunday, didn't all of that sort of scratch your conscience a little in working for Cosmo?
Not right away, it didn't. I was young and I was ambitious, and I had already, in that first newspaper job that I went to in California after I graduated from college, there was a woman there sitting next to me who had also gone to the University of Missouri, and she taught me how to make up stories in that newspaper.
Okay.
So I'm like, oh, okay, so we've got all these ideals in J school, but when we get out in the real world, this is how it works. You know, I'm in my 20s, what do I know?
So it's basically fabricating stories?
Yeah, she was making it up. She says, you know, it's easier. And she said, you can make up people to quote. She said, use the word Johnson, because a last name of Johnson, because she said Jones and Smith sound like made up names.
So you want to be common, but not too common.
Johnson is the third most common name, she said, in America. And she says, but there's a million Johnsons in L.A. So if you name Mary Johnson, nobody knows who you're talking about.
So in these fake stories that you were making up, these fabricated stories that are passing off as true, aren't there some pictures in these stories sometimes? So are these models that are just sort of modeling?
Oh, well, now you're talking about Cosmo, or you're talking about the newspaper. Now, the newspaper, first of all, not everything was made up. These were anecdotes.
No, I was talking about Cosmo.
Okay,
then.
Cosmo. Yeah, now, Cosmo, no, there's not. If there are real people, there'll be real pictures.
Yeah.
But if you look at Cosmo, there's a lot of glamour shots, you know, that are not real people. I think most people know those are not real people. But what they don't realize was those anecdotes we made up were also not real. Yeah.
Would you say that you were being influenced by the times at that time, with the sexual revolution budding, and you working for Cosmo? You didn't really have a problem talking about two people who had just met, and then they have sexual liaison, and then they just stop.
Okay, now let's go back to
meeting
that.
Each other?
Because what happened? Okay, why were those stories made up? Now let's go back a little bit to the sexual revolution, and let's go back to Alfred Kinsey.
Good.
I hope everybody knows who Kinsey was. He did the Kinsey reports on male sexuality, on female sexuality in the late 40s and the early 50s. Okay, Kinsey's he analyzed sex for the first time. He was a biologist. He was actually the world's leading expert on the gall wasp, and he diced and sliced sexuality without love. It was all about, he split sex from love. There was no love in his statistics.
Right.
He created all of these statistics. Kinsey's statistics were very, very, very suspect. In fact, they were basically baloney. And what he said was that this is the way that all normal people were living in America. It wasn't. He had actually gone into prisons and interviewed sex offenders. He'd interviewed a lot of prostitutes, but he said that his statistics were true for the average normal American. Farm boys, he said 17% of farm boys were having sex with animals. I mean, he had all of this wacky stuff, okay? The media went crazy over Kinsey. Okay?
Why do you think it went crazy?
Sex sells.
Even back then?
Of course. Of course. So the media went crazy. There was Lionel Trilling, who was a social scientist at Columbia University, said Kinsey had acquired more authority with the American public in a month than Freud had acquired in a lifetime.
That's incredible.
Okay, but his statistics didn't hold up. Those people were not all over America. They were a very small minority of people. So when you go to Cosmo, so then what happened? Who was Kinsey's pamphleteer? Was the first person to take Kinsey's statistics, false statistics, and blast them all over and make millions and millions of dollars was, guess who? Hugh Hefner. Playboy.
Yeah.
Kinsey reduced.
Capitalized.
Yeah, Kinsey reduced a woman and a man, but especially a woman, to a sexual animal. And then Hugh Hefner comes along, creates the Playboy bunny. Okay, here we've got a sexual animal. What do you think
the motive here is? Money?
Money. Money.
Okay.
So
exploit human beings for money was...
Of course.
Okay, so...
Yeah, it's money. It's
there
money.
You go.
Yeah, a friend of mine, she read my book because, you know, I was writing these articles for money too. She said somebody should write a book called Lying for Money, because so everybody does it. So many people do it. But anyway, so Playboy comes along with the Playboy bunny. Cosmo, Helen Gurley Brown, comes along, talks to Hugh Hefner, creates a Playboy clone, gets some of his same writers, gets some of his same agents, and creates a Playboy clone. A woman's
In Cosmopolitan
Playboy.
magazine.
Yeah, a woman's Playboy.
Yeah.
And she creates the Cosmo Pussycat. So
I-
again, we've got a woman
Interesting.
reduced to a pussycat. He reduces a woman to a bunny.
Yes.
She reduces a woman to a pussycat. And then, but these people are not real. So how are we going to,
My question is, how did it sell so well? I can understand it with titillating men. Why did women buy the whole thing?
well, women are interested in sex.
No, I know, but being objectified as a bunny or
yeah,
what have
see,
you?
that was, I call that the greatest marketing scheme of the 20th century. How did she do that? Well, it was a very soft sell. It was a romantic sell. So as I say, so that's what she was doing. She was selling. It wasn't. Yes, Cosmo had the first male centerfold in America.
Right, in 72?
Yeah, 72.
Okay.
Yeah.
Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, Burt Reynolds,
Right.
yes.
But-
And my first article that I ever wrote for Cosmo was about, it appeared about 10 pages before that centerfold, and nobody ever read it, I don't think, because they're all looking through it for Burt.
That's funny. But by and large, Cosmo centered on or focused on the female psyche, the emotional, romantic part of the whole sexual revolution thing, whereas Playboy and you know that direction sort of focused on the male psyche and just
That's right.
raw animal sexuality.
right.
Okay. All right. So that's how she made.
It was
she made so well.
glamour.
Yeah,
It was softer. You know,
Yeah.
it was very soft. Actually, Cosmo today is much more hardcore than it was back then. It was very soft and seductive.
Okay.
Yeah. And within it, okay, we're going to talk about propaganda. Propaganda is half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. Most people think propaganda is a bunch of lies, and so they can spot it immediately.
People are too smart for that.
Right,
Yeah.
right, exactly. But it's actually half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. So a lot of those articles in Cosmo were real, okay? I wrote an article on how to buy a used car. You know, these are young women who don't have much money and they need to buy a used car. I wrote an article on those horrible harrowing headaches. It was a legitimate story.
Okay.
So within all of this real stuff was embedded this fake sexual revolution stuff.
Yes.
So it was very hard to sort out the
Right.
real from the fake there.
And with all the glamour and glitz, it was attractive at the
It
time.
was very attractive, very
Okay.
attractive, and yeah.
All right, so then we have the other side of the coin where Betty Friedan was doing her women's movements thing with the National Organization for Women. Her focus wasn't the sexual revolution. Her focus was more, let's get equality of dignity and equality of pay and a respect for the personhood of women. And the sexual revolution really wasn't part of her radar at that time, was it?
No, she actually called Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible.
Interesting.
Right. She was for economic and educational opportunities for women.
Okay.
Okay, so you have to remember, see, a lot of the young people today don't remember this, but the women's movement was a very unifying movement because women were going into the workforce in droves and were encountering all these injustices. So, for example, women were being fired for being pregnant. Betty Friedan had been fired in the 1940s for being pregnant. See? Married women could not apply for credit in their own name. In some states, a woman couldn't serve on a jury. There were no maternity benefits. Well, they didn't have to. They were firing them before they got there. So there were so many things going on. There were no girls' sports programs and stuff like that in schools. In a lot of law schools and medical schools, women couldn't get in. So at that time, women were very united in wanting to put a stop to all this. And that's why feminism made so much sense in the 60s. I was a feminist. Yes, I want to put a stop to this. Yes, I would like equal pay for equal work. Yeah.
Okay. So it made sense to you at the time.
It did.
And we were talking before we went on air that traditionally there was something called the first wave feminism that happened in, what, the 1920s?
Actually, before that.
The teens?
1920 was when,
Okay.
when women won the right to vote.
Suffrage,
But
yeah.
it was actually in the late 1800s and the early, it had actually started in the late 1800s, but then it had kind of fallen into disuse.
Was the main gist of that one the right to vote, or were there other
Yes.
things that were
No,
on the docket?
it was
Okay.
the right to vote. That's what they
Okay.
wanted, because they figured at that point, if women had the right to vote, they would take care of everything else.
Okay,
you know?
so-
and property too. I mean, they wanted the right to own property. It was a property thing, a right to vote. But there was also a sexual element to it, in that these women didn't want. These women didn't want to be raped. How do I say that? Go figure, right?
Sure.
Right. And so sometimes there was one thing that women were protesting was that when they were married, their husbands didn't treat them with respect.
Okay.
And so we're talking about sexual coercion, if not rape, within marriage. So they were also protesting that. So there were those kinds of protests. It wasn't about educational opportunities at that point too much.
Or workplace problems.
Or workplace problems, because there weren't that many in the workforce at that time.
Right.
You see, when we entered the workforce in droves in the 50s and 60s, that's when we began to encounter all those problems. We didn't.
Now, I know there was a big push for women to work during World War II, but would you
Right.
say, and that sort of waned a little bit, but then came the 50s and 60s, would you say that the explosion of women going out to the workforce in that time era had to do with contraception, had to do with being unnaturally freed up to be sterilized in order to go to the workforce and have a career?
I don't. I
Because the
can't
pill was
really
invented right around 1960, right?
Yeah, I can't say that. Women were already going into the workforce, and there were a lot of single women in the workforce at that time.
Okay.
That's why Cosmo, Helen Gurley Brown wrote Sex and the Single Girl. The single girl was out there in droves. There weren't as many married women in the well, because you're being fired for being pregnant. There weren't as many married women in the early feminist movement.
Yeah.
It was a lot of
if you think
in
about
that year, yeah.
before the Industrial Revolution, women got married very early. And men did
Yeah,
too,
yeah.
I think, much earlier than they did
Right,
later on.
right.
After the Industrial Revolution, you start seeing marriages go into their mid-20s, late 20s, now it's 30s. And so either you are a very virtuous people and you do whatever you can properly and morally to save yourself for marriage, or you get sucked into what was going on at the time.
That's right.
So let's go back to Helen Gurley Brown's sexual revolution and Betty Friedan's women's movements. And there was a unifying factor there, wasn't there, that finally brought these two things together into one. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, we actually found the actual night that it actually happened. But we're going to start. Betty Friedan was a magazine writer in New York City.
Okay.
And there was a man in New York City named Larry Lader, who was the co-founder with Dr. Bernard Nathanson of the National Abortion Rights Action League. It was originally the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws.
Okay.
And it's now NARAL, Pro-Choice America. Notice how the names change as the times change. That's one of those propaganda tools. You
Control the language, you can control the
adapt.
people.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right? Abuse of language is abuse of power.
Yes, no question. We'd have a whole show on that. And how,
Yes, we could indeed.
How the cultural left has just continually changed the language for their own political purposes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It keeps changing. It keeps morphing.
Every decade it keeps morphing. Yeah.
So anyway, Larry Lader worked with Bernard Nathanson at NARAL. NARAL hadn't actually been formed yet, but Larry Lader was Margaret Sanger's biographer. He was a magazine writer he was a Harvard graduate. He was an heir of old money, so he had lots of time on his hands to do whatever he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was make abortion legal. That was his greatest passion in life.
Do you know why?
It's hard to say what it was. He thought, he was a population planner. He thought we were breeding ourselves to death.
Okay.
You know, that the whole world was
that
going to the whole world was going to starve to death if we didn't stop breeding ourselves to death. But he also called pregnancy. He was also a sexual revolutionary, and he called pregnancy the ultimate punishment for sex. Pregnancy, the ultimate punishment for sex.
The natural end or purpose is the ultimate punishment.
Right, the ultimate punishment.
I mean, doesn't he realize that he would not exist if there was no pregnancy?
I don't think
if his mother wasn't punished, quote unquote.
Well, he did have a couple kids, just two, but you could have two because that was the replacement value, right?
Yeah.
But you couldn't have any more because then you were wrecking the planet. You know, all these hungry people were going to eat up all the food. All these people, especially in poor countries, were going to eat up all his food. I mean, it was weird. It was weird.
Influenced by that whole population bomb and Paul Ehrlich's book and all of that. Okay.
Yeah. He even wrote a book called "Breeding Ourselves to Death."
So obviously he was very wrong, but he didn't know it at the time.
Well, we hope he didn't
so
know.
that is, his motivation may have been a combination of those things, and he comes out both barrels with Betty Friedan trying to convince her to bring the sexual revolution into the women's movement, yes?
Right. He tries to convince her to insert abortion in the women's movement.
Okay.
He says that a women need abortion to be free, okay? And he picked up on a phrase or a slogan that Margaret Sanger had created, and we've all heard it: no woman can be free unless she owns and controls her own body. Now, we've all heard that. That was Margaret Sanger's saying, but Margaret Sanger, now this is an interesting thing people don't know, Margaret Sanger was against abortion. She called abortion barbaric. And she and Larry later had a fight over this that was not resolved at her death. Now, we all know, I think most people know, that Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, just for the record.
Yes. Was she a eugenist also?
Yeah, she was.
Okay.
Yeah,
so contraception to her had a sort of a racial, ethnic
she could
motive
get rid
also.
of. You could get rid of those undesirable people.
Yeah.
She was definitely a sexual radical.
Okay. So later, Larry later took it to the next step. We're sterilizing people with contraception, and you think that's good. Why not, quote unquote, control your own body by killing the child within?
Right.
Of course,
And
he wouldn't say that, of course.
That was his new idea. He loved that idea. That was his idea.
Yeah, we have the technology now. Let's do it.
Right. And he says it's safer now because of hospitals. You can do it in hospitals, and so let's do it. So he actually wrote a book, which I call a masterpiece of propaganda. He wrote this in 1966, I think it is. Let's double check that, because I want to make sure I've got it right. Yeah, 1966.
Okay.
It's called Abortion, but the subtitle is itself a piece of propaganda. Listen to this subtitle.
All right.
The first authoritative and documented report on the laws and practices governing abortion in the U.S. and around the world, and how, for the sake of women everywhere, they can and must be reformed. He wanted to make abortion legal. That was his goal.
For the sake of women everywhere.
Everywhere, across the world, around the world. And Betty Friedan read this book and liked it. He had been trying to convince her that women needed abortion to be free. They had worked together for a number of years in a library in New York City, in the public library. There was a place in the public library where you could write your book, and they worked together in there. He tried to convince her abortion was something women needed to be free. Now listen to this. Betty Friedan reads this book. She didn't believe him. She didn't include abortion and contraception in The Feminine Mystique, which was her book in 1963. Never mentioned it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, that was in '63. In 1966, she writes, Lawrence Lader's book is the first daring revelation of the cruelty and damage inflicted on American women by our antiquated abortion laws. It is not only an authoritative study of the hypocrisy and absurdity of abortion practices, it is a courageous blueprint of what women must do to abolish the state's power to force them to bear a child against their will.
How did she go from black to white, from white to black, actually?
That's a good question, and we don't know exactly what he said to her. We know that this book, as I say, is a masterpiece of propaganda. It is filled with half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. And I didn't even try to sort out all the lies in this book because Joseph Della Pena, who's a Villanova University law history professor, wrote a book that's over 1,200 pages long on dispelling the myths of abortion history, and that entered in these myths that entered into our culture largely through Larry Lader and his another lawyer, a NARAL lawyer, Larry Lader was not a lawyer, but a lawyer named Cyril Chestnut Means. He was a NARAL attorney. So the two of them, Larry Lader, Cyril Means, and then there was a third man, James Moore, M-O-R-H-R, who rewrote abortion history, and actually got it inserted into Roe v. Wade.
Amazing.
That's why Roe v. Wade has been so radically criticized for so long, because it's based on error, great error.
Yeah.
Great error.
Before we get to the Supreme Court ruling, Bernard Nathanson, he was the co-founder of NARAL.
Yes, he was.
And he was friends with this Larry Lader.
Yes, he was.
And Larry Lader was friends also with Betty Friedan,
Yes.
and earlier with
Margaret Sanger.
Margaret Sanger. So you have this network going on. Now, Bernard Nathanson eventually became a huge pro-life advocate after he did hundreds of thousands of abortions. He saw one in a sonogram, I believe.
Right.
And kind of similar to the Abby Johnson story. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yes, right. I know
And
Abby.
so when you see the reality of what you've been doing for so long, it just hits you like a ton of bricks.
Yes.
So he eventually became a pro-life advocate, and didn't he create Silent Scream and Eclipse of
Yes, he
Reason?
did.
Those two
Yes, he did.
videos.
Yes,
Okay,
he did.
you can see those on. Just Google them. They're on the internet if you want to see them. But,
He was a doctor.
Yeah.
And he claimed responsibility, not personal, he didn't actually do all these, but he claimed responsibility for 70,000 abortions before he realized that is a living being in there.
New York City, right?
New York City,
Okay.
yeah.
So what was his role in this whole thing of what kind of work did he do with Larry Lader in order to get the ball rolling here to get abortion legal?
They co-founded NARAL together.
Okay.
And he also, I was at a conference shortly after I became Catholic. I don't know if we've gone into that.
We haven't, no.
Yeah, but anyway, I went to a conference where Bernard Nathanson spoke. And he was getting very old at that point. He was in a wheelchair, actually. But he had written a pamphlet on how they sold the abortion lie to the American people and all the propaganda that they used. One thing that they did was they vilified the Catholic Church.
Catholic Church was number one enemy.
Yeah, enemy number one. And that's what Lader was fiercely anti-Catholic. Fiercely anti-Catholic.
They knew where their challenge was.
They knew they knew who was
Yeah.
going to try to stop them.
Right.
They
Really,
knew
only
where the
force in
whole
the world.
truth was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So eventually you became part of the enemy.
Yeah.
You became a Catholic.
I'm not. Yeah, I am. I joined forces.
Yes, you joined forces with Catholic. So you were brought up Congregationalists.
Right.
Did you and your husband stop going to church
Yes.
during your marriage? Okay, so that's what I figured. So you sort of had a sort of whatever is out there. You probably had a dim vision of God. You were probably a theist. You believed in God.
Okay, I was. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your husband?
My husband had grown up on a farm in Missouri and had a very tough, poor life. And he found God in college, and he became an Episcopalian.
Okay.
And he was much more religious than I was. He had a deep soul.
Okay.
And he knew, even though we had left, so we got married in the Episcopal Church.
Okay.
And then shortly after that, we moved here, we moved there, and all the religion began to disappear completely in our lives. But it was always in Walter's heart. And
Okay.
so he was the one that actually said to me one day, we actually went back to the Episcopal Church after our children were grown up, and our daughter was coming home from college. And we'd moved a lot. And when you read my book, you'll see we're just moving across the country. So we
Right.
had no communities, right?
Right.
And my daughter's coming home from college, and I wanted her to have a community in this new place that we had moved. And I said, let's go back to church.
And what church did you go back
We
to?
went back to the Episcopal
Okay.
Church. Okay.
So I know we don't have much time to talk about this part of your life, but what brought you from going back to the Episcopal Church and sort of getting your feet wet to converting to Catholicism?
Well, it was interesting because that Episcopal Church where we really found community, somebody came to that church one day who was Catholic, and they said that our service was more Catholic than the church he had just gone to, the Catholic church he had just gone to. The priest at the Episcopal Church had married a woman who was going to be a nun. So she had been Catholic at one point. And so they were playing Gregorian chants before the services. So when we moved again, we were always moving, we moved from that beautiful little place up to Northern California. And the Episcopal Church up there was really falling apart. There was, they had lay people giving the homilies. And and then I'd go home and go, well, where did they get that wrong? I'd be reading my Bible, which was a good thing, but where did they get that wrong? And so we tried a number of churches, and finally Walter said, well, maybe we should try the Catholic Church. And I said, I'm not going to join that patriarchal old church.
That was
of course.
Okay.
There's my feminism coming up,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right? Then I started to read history, a little history. Walter, again, was a big history buff. And I was not. I'm a journalist. I was the news of the hour. So I begin to read these history books, and I'm like, I read Luther, and he was kind of a foul-mouthed fellow. And he said, if women die bearing children, well, just let them die. That's what they're made for. I mean, stuff like that. And I'm like, wow, this is not a feminine. This is the Protestant church, and he founded it. And oh, I don't know. That doesn't sound like it's good for women. So let's go to Henry VIII. Well, he's killing wives left and right.
Yes.
And Walter says that's because he didn't want a woman to rule England, which was true.
Okay.
So I said, okay, all right, let's go look at the
And he had his
Catholic Church.
genetics wrong too. He thought that it was the woman's fault that she wasn't having sons.
That's right. So we go to the Catholic Church, and because of the Novus Ordo, which I know there's a lot of dispute about that, but it was very much like our Episcopal Church because, in fact, I didn't see much difference between the two. Of course, there is a big difference, the Eucharist,
Right.
but I didn't know that. And we had this wonderful priest who was a Jewish convert, and he told us, he catechized us himself, and it was a little church. And he said that we should get the catechism and read the part about the Eucharist and then come back the next week.
Interesting.
So we did, and we got 2 books. We got 2 catechisms, one for Walter and one for me. I read that catechism. I could not put it down.
I don't blame you.
read it for 3 days straight. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was all the things I've been searching for all my life.
Interesting.
It was all about truth and love and beauty and forgiveness, and it's got all those footnotes in it, you know?
Yeah,
and
good footnotes.
And I go, well, where does it say that in the Bible? And I go, oh, I see.
funny.
Well, where does it say that in the Bible? Oh. And so, and I just fell head over heels in love with the truth. The
Yes.
truth will set
Yes.
you free, and it did.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think there's somewhere in your book where you say, what if Betty Friedan knew about the Catholic faith?
That's an interesting thing. She did
Yeah.
not.
Right.
She had some women in that National Organization for Women that were Catholic, but they were very loosey-goosey, if you were, and they weren't teaching her the truth at all.
Wow. So what if Betty Friedan and Helen Gurley Brown and all the others were properly introduced to this truth that you found? What would the world be like today?
Oh, it would be so much different.
Yeah.
So much different.
Yeah.
It's a sad thing. We've lost the understanding of the faith, but you know what we've really lost? We've lost the joy of it all. The joy of it all. Everybody's looking for that happiness and joy. We found it. Christ is in Christ.
And I think that in your book you mentioned that Friedan was sort of touching on something that housewives at that time were feeling depressed. They had it all, the kids, the white picket fence, the big house, the car, but is this all there is?
That's right. They were searching for truth.
I think she was searching for what else there was.
Yes.
They all were. And
Yes.
I'm thinking to myself, you know, the 1950s and 60s were a time, it was post-World War II, you know.
Exactly.
The country was becoming very prosperous. Everybody wanted a piece of the American pie, or the American dream, that is. And I don't know, it just seemed like even though religion was in place, it seemed like a rather materialistic kind of milieu to live in.
Okay.
And they were searching for something, and they couldn't find it because they were searching in the wrong places.
That's right. That's right. But it was also a time of great fear. Remember,
Yes. Soviet
as
Union.
children,
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up under the bomb. That we had bomb raids where you dive in under your desk.
Good point.
And you'd hear noise and think, is that the big one? Is it over? I
Yeah.
mean, it was like that. So it was a fear culture. We still live in the fear culture, by the way. And Walter, my beloved husband, had a theory about this. He said,
Yeah.
what makes you forget your fears, at least for a moment? Sex.
I see.
Lots of sex.
Yeah.
That keeps you focused on the moment.
As does alcohol or drugs or any other addiction.
Any other thing.
Yeah. Interesting. It seems like today more and more are starting to fear climate change and what it's going to do to the world.
Whatever. Yeah, whatever the new fear
whatever it is. Yeah.
Let's all be afraid because we're all going to die. Guess what? We are all going to die, but
Yeah.
God is with us.
Yes. Yes. Isn't that great?
We're still immortal.
Yeah.
In Christ.
So let's.
How good is that?
It's awesome. It really is. I just don't understand why more people take this life as
The only
seriously
one.
as they do in terms of grabbing onto it like they do. I mean, it goes by in an instant, relatively speaking.
does.
What's 8 decades, you know, 8 or 9
It's nothing.
decades? It's nothing.
No.
And I think you knew that throughout your life, but you were sort of burying those questions, right? Those
You
big
do.
questions,
Yeah, you
like a lot of people do.
Right.
They're sort of, all right, well, we'll deal with those later, maybe when I get older. Let's have some fun now and do what the world is telling us to do,
That's
kind of thing.
That's
And if the world is telling you to do all of these destructive things that eventually create a culture of death in which at least 1/3 of us are killed before birth today, it's mind blowing if you think about what we are in today and in the past 40 years. We should be shouting for the rooftops.
We should. We're
Yeah.
trying to here, aren't we?
This is the rooftop.
This is as tall as it gets. But people need to remember that, you know, look inside yourself. The interior life is the spiritual life. What's going on in there? Are you depressed? Are you afraid? Are you anxious? Are you all upset? Turn off the noise. Get rid of the cell phone. Sit and listen. Listen to the beautiful silence of the universe.
Yeah.
And that's where you will find God.
Yeah, they say that you can only hear God in silence.
That's right.
And we live in such a noisy world today.
We do.
Yeah.
We do.
Not only with the ears, but the eyes.
Everywhere.
Everything is
The
just
memory.
in the
Everything.
memory. Yes,
Everything.
Yes.
The eating. We're eating all the time. Gotta eat, gotta eat, gotta eat. So many things to distract us from
So you-
reality.
You have this insight now, and you look back and you say, wow, I can't believe how off track our society has gone.
Right.
Does it get you sad to think what could have and should have been?
It's a very sad thing to look at the world, and it's a very joyous thing to look at God. So what are we going to look at? Well, I choose to look at God.
There you go. That's a great way to end the show, but we've got 9 minutes left, so we've got to.
Okay, well,
there's so much more to talk about.
Joy.
I know we missed a lot of things here.
Yeah, we have.
What important things do you want to touch upon?
Okay, we need to talk about the night that the abortion was inserted in the women's movement.
Good.
It was on November.
That's important.
That was important, and it took me many, many moons to find out that night and what actually happened. I got the minutes of the meeting. The National Organization for Women actually has their files, their papers at the Schlesinger Library, and you have to get permission to get in. And so I said to a friend of mine, well, they're not going to give me permission to read it.
Where's the Schlesinger Library?
That's in Cambridge.
Okay.
Yeah, and at Radcliffe.
Okay.
At Radcliffe. And so I said, they're not going to give me permission to get in. And she says, oh, try it. They might. I had permission within a week. And so I got into the Now's papers and I got all of this information. So anyway, we know that abortion was inserted into the feminist movement on November 18th, 1967 in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel when about 100 feminists, very fervent feminists, met in that room that day to draw up the National Organization's Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights is still what governs a lot of the feminist movement today.
And at that point, Friedan was for abortion, right? At that point?
She had been convinced by Larry Lader that she needed to have that as one of her rights. So they voted on 8 rights that day, and 6 of them passed unanimously. There were things like a woman shouldn't be fired for being pregnant, and she should have maternity rights, equal pay for equal work, equal educational opportunities. She should be educated to her full potential. Things that we all agree on. A family should be able to deduct child care expenses from their income taxes. Stuff like that. Normal stuff. There were two rights that day and night, because it lasted till midnight, almost midnight, that created an uproar. One was the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay. That one has been now defeated.
Right.
The other was the abortion right. That created an absolute uproar, and it's all in the book in chapter 5. A fly on the wall of the Chinese room, where the reader, can actually go into that room and live that moment when abortion was inserted into the feminist movement, when the sexual revolution and the feminist movement became one. And it was a big battle. These are feminists. One of them says, "I'm against murder." I mean, it was like a microcosm of what we're still fighting in our country today.
Yeah.
And when the dust settled, only 57 people, a mere 57 people, had voted to insert abortion, contraception, and sex education, because they were all together in one little package, into the women's movement.
And how many were against, or was there?
Well, I forget about it, because a lot of those women, so there were only 100 there. 57, only 57 voted, and there were, and against it was like 16 or something. I don't know exactly the figure anymore.
There must have been such a party in hell at that moment.
It was really amazing, amazing. And 1/3 of those feminists walked out and later resigned from Now over the abortion vote. And where did they go? Well, one of those women was Betty Boyer, who was a Cleveland attorney. She went back to Ohio, and she again, a fervent feminist, founded the Women's Equity Action League, WEAL. Pro-life feminism.
Okay.
WEAL, exactly. Okay. And WEAL was, they fought to get women on juries. They fought to get rid of help-wanted male and help-wanted female ads and classified ads. They fought for a lot of rights that women wanted, legitimate rights, and they won them. But the interesting thing is that, looking back, I realized that pro-life family feminists who walked out of that meeting that night did a lot of the work behind the scenes, and pro-abortion feminists got most of the media credit. So what you've got there is an undercurrent of people who actually, actually fought for this, but didn't get credit in the media. And so people think
Yeah.
all feminism is pro-abortion. It's not.
Is WHEEL still around today?
No.
Is something similar to it? Where are the pro-life feminists
Well,
today?
they're all over the place, actually.
But are they in any
there's-
organization
There's
today?
Feminists for Life.
Feminists for
There's
Life.
Feminists for Life. There's a new Catholic feminist organization. They're jumping up again because guess what? The Me Too movement has revitalized
Yes.
feminism,
Makes
and
sense.
and we're all against that. But guess what? That's caused that Me Too movement. The
very
result
interesting.
is the result of the false joining of
That's right.
feminism with the
Exactly.
sexual revolution.
That's exactly what I was thinking. So the Me Too movement might be the beginning of the untwining, if you will.
I'd love to see that.
The ungluing of those two movements.
I hope so. That's what we want.
Yeah.
That's what we want. And that's what the new feminists, the new Christian feminists are saying, that we have got the truth and we have to get the truth out because people don't get it.
Right. Now, I think a lot of people, when they think of feminism, now before the show started, you said it was the F word to a lot of
Right,
people.
to a lot of, especially Christians.
Now, when you think of feminism, a lot of people think of it's a movement that is seeking to erase all the differences between men and women, to make them be the same thing, and you know, a movement that says equality means sameness.
Yeah, no,
And
I never meant that.
And that's not the true understanding of
No.
feminism. That's a bastardized understanding of
Right,
feminism,
right.
because with the
Right.
pill and with the sexual revolution, feminism, in a sense, became masculinism.
Yes, it did.
You sterilize the women. They try to become more like men and so forth, and they become, in a sense, you know, second-class men, and,
Right,
and that kind
right.
of mentality.
Exactly.
But true feminism is lifting up femininity, recognizing the difference, the
right.
God-given, beautiful, complementary difference
That's right.
between males and females, the masculine and the feminine.
That's right.
That's important to understand, that equality does not mean sameness.
That's correct.
Right?
That's exactly correct. And Betty Friedan said that too.
Yeah.
She said, we don't want a culture where men are having sex with men and women are having sex with women. That's what she said.
Really? And that was
Yes,
back in the
Betty
late
Friedan.
60s.
Well, in the 70s.
Okay, in
yeah.
the 70s.
Yeah, and she
Yeah.
said, and in 1979, she says, feminism has come to a dead end. She said, our blind spot, I'm sorry, it was 1981. She said, our blind spot was the family.
Yeah. And now, as the slippery slope
Yes.
continued, we
Yes.
have same-sex marriage, we have the transgender movement, we've got, I don't know how many letters there are now in the LGBT, you know, lexicon. We have all of these things going on that we have completely lost our identity as human beings, as male and female. How do we get back to sanity? We only have a couple minutes left.
We've lost our minds.
We've
is
lost
what
our minds.
done.
I always say today we live in the age of insanity.
We do.
Yeah,
it's absolutely nuts.
There was the antiquity, there was the Middle Ages, there's the modern age. Today is the age of insanity.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think we do have to get back to the truth, and the truth is Christ. I mean, we have to go back to the truth. We've got it. You and I have got it. There are few people who have got it. We've got to proclaim that Christ to the rooftops. We can't lose this anymore. This is just a terrible situation that we're in. But as I say, we have to remember, Christ has already won.
Yes, and we have to enable people to recognize the fullness of Christ.
Right.
Not what the media says about Christ,
Right.
or what Pastor Tom says about Christ, but
Right.
the fullness of Christ.
That's right.
In the church that he established when he was on earth, before
That's
he
right.
ascended into heaven.
That's right.
Is there anything more important?
Nothing.
Okay.
God or nothing. That's what
Yeah.
Cardinal Sarah says.
Yeah, and until we recognize that, we will not have a culture of life.
We will not have a culture at all pretty soon.
Do
We will
you-
not have a country.
All right, let me, in one of my last questions to you, a realistic assessment, where will we be in this society in 20 years from today,
There's no way to know. It depends on what we do right now.
right now?
What
Either
you
we
and
go
I
one
do,
way or the
that's
other.
right. That's
Either
right.
there's a massive conversion or there's a massive death and destruction.
Exactly. And it's up to us to be heroes, to make it go the right way.
Martyrs, with a martyr's heart.
With a martyr's heart. Amen
Yeah.
to that.
You have a new book coming out? Why don't we
Yes.
just end with that?
Yes.
What is it
Okay.
all about?
Well, it's the Christian feminism carried a bit farther, and we're going to talk about that sexual politics thing and how all of the lesbianism and homosexuality got tied into the
Right.
feminism, because we've just talked about abortion here, but it goes farther.
Oh, the divorce culture was another,
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
thing that happened
Right.
as a result. And of course, euthanasia, and it goes on and on.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Subverted is your first book, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movements, and you recognize that you actually helped that happen.
Yes,
and now,
yes, and I had to come clean.
You came
Well, that-
clean before God, and in His infinite mercy, you are in His grace. Thanks be to God, as hopefully we all are. But I want to say a little bit about the sacrament of confession before we leave. I think this is an important thing.
Well, we should go as much as possible. And this,
You're a new Catholic. What was it like for you to go?
Oh, well, confession, because I told so many lies, I became a victim of my own lies. And my husband and I aborted our third child. And it was through confession that I began to be healed from that.
And your husband too?
Yes. Yes, and it was the Catholic Church that brought us out of that. And I say, anybody out there, 1/3 of women now have had abortions. Go to confession, get healed, God forgives you.
Yes, indeed. Truth and mercy.
Amen.
Both are important. Wow. Your new book doesn't have a title yet, is that right?
No, I'm thinking of calling it The Joyful Christian Feminist, maybe,
Okay.
because the other feminists are so mad. We're not mad. We're not mad. We got the answers.
You're definitely not mad. Sue Ellen Browder, any last thoughts?
No, but I thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
I just, as I say, if anybody out there has had an abortion, please seek healing. Seek healing.
Thank you so much for coming here. I know you've done 1 million of these interviews. Just look her up on the internet. Sue Ellen Browder, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm Paul Morano. Thanks for joining us today in this great discussion with Sue Ellen from Knights of Columbus Presents. Thank you.